And so I want to think about, well, we know how to access a list using an index. And I'll explain a little bit later why you might want to do this. But let's explore using lists with indexing. Meaning we're going to access it using a for loop and a range. And there could be many reasons why you might want it, but there's one specific reason which I'll cover at the end. But let's actually take a look. Remember what we said for some V in some list, and then we had body of loop. And this list could be something like 1, 3, or 5, or it could be something like range 0 to 10 or just 10. You know, we can write different types of lists in there. And remember indexing. So if we have some list equals 10, 30, 70, 40, and I index at 0, I'm going to get 10, and I index at 1, I'm going to get 30, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to keep getting those numbers as we go through. So what I could do is I could, and by the way, don't use n. I know we've been using n, but when we're doing indexing, we really don't use n because n just stands for a number. But when we're doing indexing, we want to actually use something better. And that thing that we usually use is I, because it's an abbreviation for index. You can also call it index or IDX. But when we're using lists or indexing and that variable means an index, then we usually call it something else like I or index or something. And we can go through 4 items, right? We can do 4. There's 4 things in this list, 10, 30, 70, 40. But what if the list changes? What if I add stuff to it? And it's not going to work anymore. So instead, we can actually get the length of the list. And by putting the length of the list, it's now going to return 4 for this list, but it might return something else later on if the list size changes. And the element at index, and let's give it the index, convert it to a string so we can concatenate. And then we want the value, concatenate that with the equals and the value we want is LST bracket. And what number we're going to put in there? We're not going to put 0, we're not going to put 1 in there. We're going to put our variable I in there. Our index is going to go in there. And I messed something up. Not sure where I messed it up, but let's try it again. And print. And oh, I'm missing a parenthesis at the end. Yep, thank you. And now it printed out and it actually grabbed. So the first time through it said 0, I was 0. It printed LST bracket 0. The second time through I was 1, printed out 30. Third time through I was 2, printed out 70 because it's going through this one at a time. So now we have the ability to use that index for something, which is interesting, and I'll explain a little bit later why that's a better way of using it. But first, I want to talk about a little bit of a problem. Not a problem, but I want a function. I want a function to filter negative values. So I want to talk about functions before I talk about the use of indices in lists. Let's say I have a list with both positive and negative numbers in it. And I provide that as input into some function that's going to be called filter negatives. And I'm going to get a list that doesn't have the negatives. So -2 will drop, 2 will be there, 3 will be there, -1 will be dropped. 0 is not a negative number, so that'll actually be included. So I want to write this as a file, and I'm going to use the indexing method for it. Do I have to? Not really, but it's just a nice way of showing it. And so if I define my function, negatives, I'm going to take a list called for numbers. And just while I'm sitting here, I'm going to save this just because it's always a good idea to save as much as you can. So inside this function, I'd said I wanted to return an empty list or a new list. And so I need to actually have a variable that's a list. And I'm going to just set it to an empty list. I'm going to start with an empty list. I'm going to add the positive and 0 numbers to it, no negatives. So I want to make sure that it starts out empty. I don't want anything in it to start with, and I'll fill it in as I go. And then a for loop. Remember, I or index in range. What's my range going to be? And it's going to be the length of the list. And so now I don't know how big the list is because I'm in a function, right? So now I don't know how big the list is. I really have to use the length. And so this list is going to run from 0 to length -1, which means it's going to cover every single index. And then all we have to do is compare the number at that index. Just see if it's greater than or equal to 0, because 0 does count as a non-negative number. And if it is, we just need to add it to pnums. And the simplest and the way we're going to do it here is just we're just going to concatenate pnums with another list. And inside that other list is going to be a single element, which is the nums at index. This is going to create a list with whatever numbers at this current index. So depending upon what I define for my numbers, and then using this example here, two will be concatenated because -2 will not pass this test. 2 will be concatenated with nothing. So this is empty. This is going to put a 2 on the list. So this is a list of one thing, the number 2. This is going to concatenate the two lists together. And now I have a list with one item in it. And then it loops again. And the 3 is going to be true. So now I have a list with 2, and now I have a list with 3, and I concatenate them, and I get 2 things in it. And the same thing will happen for the 0. Now I put 3 things in it. So that's all we do in there. But when we're done, we have to return our value. So let's save that. Let's run it. Remember, it doesn't do anything until we call the method. And I need to pass it a list. And so let's use the list we just used, or something similar, -2, -3, 0, 2, 4. It's probably not the exact same list anymore. But still, I should get 0, 2, 4. It's the only positive numbers in there are non-negative numbers. It worked. Well, let's test different cases. Let's test only positive numbers. So let's actually erase the negatives. And let's add, let's see, 6 and 7, just to make sure we have some positive numbers. We run that. They all appeared in there. Good. It's working for all positive numbers. What if I only had negative numbers? I have a -0. So let's do a -2, -4, -6. What should be the result, right? There's nothing is going to pass. So empty list. And that's what we get, empty list, nothing passed. What if we didn't pass any number? Is that going to be an error, or is that going to just return the empty list? Yeah, an empty list. What's going to happen if it's empty is that this length will be 0. And so this entire for loop will get skipped. And so it will just return pnums, which is the empty list. And so that's how we write a function. And we're using a for loop in an index so we can actually write these kinds of functions and do these kinds of things. Did I really need the index in here? Could I rewrite this whole thing and just use nums? And the answer is, I think so. And so let's try it. What would have happened if we did this? Looks right. So let's try the very first one. Instead of filter negatives, let's use number 2. It worked the same. So you notice there really isn't any difference between doing it or not doing it. But what's a scenario where you absolutely have to? Let's actually think of, what if we wanted to write our own version of the range method? And maybe we wanted to put random numbers in there. I don't want to do random numbers today, but I'm going to do something simpler. Let's call this fill list. And fill list just takes a number. I don't know what that number is. And I want to return a list. And I want to actually add the numbers in there. And for example, I'm doing exactly like range. I'm going to put all the numbers in there. I'm going to start at 0, and I'm going to go up to num. And so if I just do this like range, and let's use index in range of num, and pnums equals, well, let's actually think about this for a second. We could literally just do the same thing. And there's no nums here. This is going to be just index. That's literally what range is doing, right? Let's see if that worked. And it did. It gave us a range. So we could actually use that method. And I could change that. Instead of putting the index in here, I could actually do something else. I could actually put random numbers in there or other things. But what if I want to update the list? And it takes a list, and I want to change the values in the list. So what if I want to change all the values in the list? So do a range for the length of nums. And I want to change the values. And let's say we're going to set everything to 0. I don't actually need to do anything or return anything because it's the same list. It actually doesn't hurt to return the same list and makes it a little more usable. But what it's going to do is it's going to zero everything out. At least I think it's going to zero everything out. Let's see. Let's actually do num list num equals fill list 10. List num has that in it. And now let's do update list with list num. And now it's all zeroed out. And in fact, it's zeroed it out. There's nothing in there. It's gone, which is good. We wanted to. That's what we want to do. So that brings back to, why do you want to ever do the indexed version? And the real answer is, the only way to update a particular value in a list is if you know its index. Let's do this one a second time. But I'm going to use the range, I'm just going to do the non-range version. How do I change that? Do I just set n equals 0? Is that going to work? I did not mean to click on you. Go away. So have that. And now let's do update list 2 and see if it actually changes it. It didn't change it. And why should it? This n is assigned the value from the list, but then it's a separate variable. It's no longer part of the list. So this will not update the list. Updates the variable n only. So if you want to update or modify the contents of a list in a loop, which is a normal thing, we usually do that a lot, you need to use the indexed version. So this is the only way to update the contents of the list using a loop. There's other ways to modify lists, but that specifically is the way to do it in a loop. So for example, to reset, maybe you have a list of numbers, something happens to them, and then you change them all. Oh, looks like someone has a question about filter negatives. Sure. It's actually the best way to talk about it is to draw it out. We're going to run out of time with our exercises, but that's okay. You get to do them on your own. Actually, I might do the first one just together, because more important, we understand what's happening here. So let's say nums that's passed in here. In fact, instead of me drawing it, let's say this is passed -2, 0, and 2. And what the result should be is 0 and 2, right? That's my expected result. And so what's going to happen is we're going to start with a pnums. And let's do iterations. I don't know, actually, I know this is 3 things. This is going to have 3 iterations. That's actually it. And then there's this index thing. And just to make my life easier, I want to know what's at nums index. And I want to know what's in pnums. And initially, in the first iteration, pnums is empty. Also, what's the index of the first number? Well, range starts at 0. 0, it's going to pass in length of 3. So it's going to be 0. What's the value of nums at index 0? -2. So this is going to be the value of nums at index 0. And that's going to be -2. And then we do an if statement. If -2 is greater than or equal to 0, well, that's false, right? So let me actually, I'm putting all this in here just so you can and this, by the way, is not a bad way of doing it. So you can see it all happening. And then pnums is at the end. So if nums index greater than or equal to 0, is -2 greater than or equal to 0? No, that's false. So we don't do anything to pnums. So pnums is going to get copied to the second iteration as is. The index is going to go to 1. Remember, the range is, this is what this is really saying is range 3. That's the length. And that's going to create a list of 0, 1, and 2. And the first thing I got, the first index I got was the 0. The second index is 1. Or the second number in the list, and that's going to be assigned to index, is going to be 1. So that means nums 1 is now going to have a value of, what's the second item in my list? 0. Remember, is nums up there? 0 greater than or equal to 0? Hey, that's true. So I need to change pnums, and I'm going to concatenate that with nums index, which is 0. That's going to give me a single number inside of my list. I now have a 0 in my list. I have a single element of 0. That iterates again to 2. Nums, remember that now we're on the 2 here in the range. What's nums 2? That's 2. 2 greater than or equals 0. Okay, that's true. That means we're going to update. So remember, we need to copy that down. So that copies down from the previous. And now we're going to concatenate with nums index. What's num index? 2. When I concatenate 2 lists together, I get a new list with both items in it. And then index is actually going to stop, or actually the whole thing's going to stop because we hit the end. And if we were to print out pnums at this point, so we're going to return pnums, but if we were to print out pnums, it's going to print a list of 0 and 2 because that's the current value of pnums. So that's what our list is going to look like. Did that help? Any other questions on this one? It's a little confusing, the fact that we're actually managing 2 lists. It's best to not think of the range as a second list when you're doing this. Just think of it as a number from 0 to whatever is passed in minus 1. So we passed in the number 3, so it goes from 0 to 2. But yeah, this is how you understand how a loop works. You want to draw it out.